By T.E. Lawrence's lifetime, the Ottoman Empire had controlled a vast region traversing Asia, Africa, and Europe since the 14th century. But during the 1910s, the power of the Ottoman Empire decreased steadily as it continued to lose territory. Events that contributed to the loss of territory for the Ottoman Empire and its weakening include the Tripolitanian War, 1911-12, the First Balkan War in 1912, and finally the First World War. The Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War I, and it was abolished officially on the 1st of November 1922. As Lawrence recounts in his book 7 Pillars of Wisdom, he was involved with Arab rebels in the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire between 1916 and 1918. He had also spent a significant amount of time in the Middle East before that too, primarily in Syria before the war, on his various archaeological expeditions. Throughout his life, Lawrence had a very complex relationship with the Arab world, one of powerful affinity, yet also of profound alienation. In a letter to his mother in 1909, for example, he wrote, "I will have much difficulty in becoming English again, for here I am Arab in habits and slip in talking from English to French and Arabic, unnoticing." Yet, in 7 Pillars of Wisdom, he writes, "The effort for these years to live in the dress of Arabs, to imitate their mental foundation," Lawrence writes, "quitted me of my English self and let me look at the West and its conventions with new eyes. At the same time," Lawrence continues, "I could not sincerely take on the Arab skin. It was an affectation only." Lawrence had intense sympathies for Arab nationalism, sympathies fortified through his involvement in the Arab revolt. But he also supported the historical movement of Zionism. In the words of Raymond Stock, Lawrence was a champion of both causes.
For a college blessed with so many bibliographical and manuscript treasures, the BA dissertation of T.E. Lawrence is one of the highlights of the college's collection. Thomas Edward Lawrence, the Lawrence of Arabia of history and legend, would earn fame, of course, as one of the leaders of a brilliant campaign of insurgency waged by Arab forces against the Ottoman Empire in the course of the First World War. Lawrence had always been interested in the ancient and medieval history of the Arabic world and of the Eastern Mediterranean, and we see this interest clearly in his BA dissertation. Lawrence was very modest about his formal education. There is an unpublished memorandum in the Bodleian Library written by Lawrence later in life, giving an account of his education. In this memorandum, Lawrence declared that he had, quote, been educated privately at the City of Oxford School and at Jesus College, Oxford. But his marginalia to this memorandum makes clear exactly what he thought about his education. He had been, quote, educated privately. Yes, he writes, at the City of Oxford School. Very little, very reluctantly, very badly, he adds, and at Jesus College, Oxford, and in brackets has added not at all. He nevertheless came under the influence of Reginald Lane Poole, a formidable medievalist who had been trained and taught at some of the finest continental universities. Despite his track record of research and teaching, Lane Poole was not able to secure a fellowship in Oxford because he was married. And in 1909-1910, he was a temporary lecturer at Jesus College. Lawrence and many of his undergraduate peers recall how they would proceed to Lane Poole's rooms after dinner in the evenings for tutorials that were inspiring, exhilarating, and brilliant. And Lane Poole's teaching was clearly decisive in consolidating Lawrence's interest in the history of the Middle Ages more widely, and in the history of the Arabic world during the Middle Ages more precisely. And Lane Poole's influence was also decisive in Lawrence's choice of dissertation topic. Dissertation is entitled "The Influence of the Crusades on European Military Architecture to the End of the 12th Century." The dissertation was in fact the result of a remarkable research expedition undertaken by Lawrence by himself in the summer of 1909. Over the course of an 83-day expedition, Lawrence returned to Jesus late in the Michaelmas term of 1909. Over the course of this 83 expedition, Lawrence covered more than 1,000 miles, most of it on foot, on his own, and only with an old revolver for security, in what was then Ottoman-controlled Palestine, Syria and Jordan. And in the course of this expedition, he explored the remains of 25 Frankish castles in the region. These castles had been constructed by those Western magnates and knights who had carved out territory following the bloody and breathtaking events of the First Crusade at the end of the 1090s. These castles, often constructed in stone, have frequently been described as crusading castles. But the label crusading does an injustice to their purpose. These castles were raised by men and women seeking to make the Levant their home. These castles were not merely fortresses, but residences of power and prestige, constructed at the centre of lordships, the homes of a colonial elite. In 1910 there had been very little work done on Frankish military architecture, since Emmanuel Guillonet had published his great study of the subject in the 1870s. Lawrence was thus, in 1909, journeying to a part of the world rarely visited by Western medievalists, and examining a subject, until then, little examined by historians. Lawrence produced 2 copies of the dissertation, and both survive. The other copy, which represents a near completed draft, is now preserved at the Houghton Library at the University of Harvard. The copy owned by Jesus College had been presented by Lawrence to the examiners, and was eventually given to the Fellows of Jesus College by Lawrence's mother after Lawrence's accidental death in 1935. Lawrence had always been reluctant to publish his dissertation, sensitive, it seems, to its flaws and shortcomings as a work of scholarship, but he nevertheless continued to add photographs and marginal notes over the course of his career. Many of these photographs and marginal notes in Lawrence's neat hand can be observed throughout the copy preserved at Jesus College. Note, for instance, the marginal note against the very first lines on the very first page of the dissertation. The note reads, in Lawrence's hand, "Apology for dullness." The dissertation was eventually published in 1936, seen through the press by Lawrence's brother after Lawrence's death, and was then republished with scholarly introduction and apparatus in 1988. For all its shortcomings, the dissertation marked an important stage in the modern study of the Frankish conquest, colonisation and exploitation of the Middle East in the Central Middle Ages. It also offers a fascinating insight into the formation of one of the most important figures in the struggle for Arab and Jewish independence. The BA dissertation of T. Lawrence is one of the great treasures of Jesus College.